Yes, would you like to say? Hello, everyone. Please come to, we're going to start again. No, I'm going to stand up here. Marie, how are we doing the? So how will you do? So that will be okay. Because they won't see her. They can also stay. I think probably easier just to stay. I think. Okay. Welcome back to the second session, where we have a panel discussion, and each member of the panel, who I'll introduce in a second, are going to speak for 5 minutes. Now, both Tara and Marie have sort of said we have to be really strict on the 5 minutes, so I will be timing you on my iPhone. And in addition to the 4 people we have on the panel, we also have someone Skyping in. Are you going to get her up now?
She is actually there.
Do you want to put her?
Muted, so I think we can bring her up.
Would you like to do that? So let me introduce our panelists, starting from my right here, Corinna Hawkes, who is Professor of Food Policy at City University in London. Marcel Bokkebom, who's Head of Food and Nutrition Security in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Netherlands. Duncan Williamson. Duncan is Food Policy Manager at WWF. Dr. Sonja Vermeulen, Head of Research at CGIR, Research Programme on Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security, better known to most of us as CCAFS. And I'm sure I'm going to mispronounce Ellen's name. Dr. Ellen Roos, who's from the Department of Energy and Technology in the Swedish University of Agricultural Science by Skype, who will appear at some stage.
At the last part.
Okay, but she can hear us now, can she?
She can, yeah.
Splendid. Hello, Ellen. Okay, so we're going to start with, I can see Ellen on this screen. You can't. Hello, Ellen. Corinna, your 5 minutes.
Shall I stay here? Or?
Whatever you like.
I prefer to stand up normally, so I'll just...
Let me get that to you.
Okay, so I've got 5 minutes. Thanks very much for the invitation to give 5 minutes of remarks, and thank you very much for Tara for 10 wonderful years of FCRN. In listening to the remarks this morning, it's quite easy to get quite scared by the prospect that we face. And you have this sort of image of this big world which is imploding in not the most pleasant way. And to cope with that, the way I cope with it, and I think the way that we as a community should cope with it more, is to start thinking more about people. I'm Professor of Food Policy, and I use the term people-centered food policy. The reason why that we care about the environment, that we care about sustainability, that we care about the food systems, is because people are affected by it. People have not enough to eat. They have poor diets. They have hopeless livelihoods and poor wages. They are affected by floods. Let's start with people and put people first and work backwards through the food system to try and solve our problems. So whatever that problem is that that person faces, that community faces, that country faces, start with that problem and then work backwards. And we need methodologies for that. But you begin to find places throughout the food system where you can intervene. I came to this conclusion after working a lot on agriculture and a lot on nutrition. And finding that my colleagues in agriculture would say, let's produce more fruits and vegetables, problem solved. No, problem not solved. Because as Tara said, I'm slightly obsessed by the issue that food is transformed through the food system, and just because what is produced doesn't necessarily reach consumers in that way. But it has a broader application to thinking about putting people's problems first and focusing on that, because then we can begin to focus and not get lost in this huge problem that is the global food system. So first of all, people-centred food policy. Now, as soon as you start doing that, you're going to hit on the private sector. The food system is basically made up of the private sector. That is the reality of it. That's small-scale farmers, and it's huge, massive agribusiness transnational corporations. What we need is good private sector innovation. How do you get that? Well, I've only got 5 minutes. I believe in a framework of regulations to help guide innovation. But you can't just have regulations. And if anyone's tweeting, please don't tweet this. I was in the back of a taxi with a guy from Cargill the other day. It was brilliant. It was brilliant. Half an hour of just gaining the best kind of insights into how that company operates. As you know, it's a privately held company, so it's quite difficult to get insights about them. And he was just going about how he gets around all these regulations. There are poultry farms in the UK. They introduced this really annoying animal welfare regulation. This is how we get round it. It's bad for the chickens, and it was just brilliant stuff. Deeply depressing, of course, but I mean, I just got a lot of insights. My point is that his focus was on how to get around those regulations, because all the incentives are lined up wrong. And that comes back to the people-centred bit and working backwards out through the food system to line up those incentives, to have those frameworks of regulations which are going to encourage innovation, but also to create the kind of right incentive structures for the private sector. Of course, doing that, the private sector knows no boundaries. I mean, if you're a small farmer, I guess it does, but the big private sector, we still live in a world of countries. The role of the state is still fundamental in our human societies. But the private sector's kind of grown out beyond that. And in fact, a lot of the food systems is a global food system. And so when we start to talk about national boundaries, they are limited. When we start to talk about regulations at the national level, they are limited. But global food governance is simply not kept up with the way the food system is. So, you know, just classic example, FAO mainly deals with production, WHO mainly deals with health. That's a very obvious example. But we just need to have global food governance, which is better. Now, I have an instant answer to this. It's a really, really difficult problem. But we need to focus on that level in the context of the fact that it's people at the local area who are affected. So it's that linking that local back to the global. And we're not going to get any of this done if we don't educate the elites. We talk a lot about educating school kids, school gardens, totally brilliant idea. We need to do that. But it's not only the school kids and the mums and the dads and the caregivers that need to be educated. It's those policy elites. I talk to people in policy at all kinds of levels a lot. And often, they are more open than they might seem to be when, thank you, Charles, when they are exposed to different ideas. So I work in an educational institution. We have fantastic students. I see one here. Wonderful students, massively engaged. But we need to have those people who are not converted at these elite levels, who are actually more open than we might believe once they are exposed to really good food policy and food systems education. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It actually wasn't an alarm went off, it was a phone call from Cargill's chief counsel. Marcel, would you like to note from there?
I'll just sit here because I scribbled down notes during the previous talks, as I was instructed to, because we weren't supposed to prepare talks, we were supposed to give reflections on what we have heard and also what we think about the way forward. Maybe just as a little introduction about myself. I was rightly introduced as working for foreign affairs, but here in the UK, that doesn't give away all of it, because in our country, foreign affairs and development cooperation and foreign trade are all in the same ministry. So I work for development cooperation and international trade, which gives me a somewhat different perspective on issues. And that is, I think, the perspective that I would like to raise here as well. But not after I congratulated Tara and Marie and others members of the network with the 10th or 11th, maybe you missed a year somewhere, anniversary. But that is about as friendly, I think, as we should be today, or maybe we should be friendly today. congratulating you, but in the end, keep on congratulating ourselves is, I think, the most dangerous state that we can get in. And that is maybe the main point I want to make. We are among friends here and we think alike, and that is maybe common for the food system, food sector as a whole. And your point on Cargill is actually illustrating that. The moment you step out a little bit, you realize there's a whole world out there that maybe thinks differently on issues like these. And I saw the two presentations before the break and realized that we agree on many of the challenges and on the analysis of what needs to be done. But what is maybe a little bit lacking, and I put that forward as a point of discussion, is where are the solutions? And for a systematic problem, there is no one solution, and I think you framed it as a wicked problem, which for which there is no solution. So that is indeed a hard one to begin with. But perhaps it will help if we start tilting our own way of thinking and our own way of approaching this. And while listening, I had to think of some bigger trends that we nowadays see in society, where hotel chains are being challenged by Airbnb, where taxi drivers and taxi companies do no longer have certainty about their bread and butter because there's this Uber taking over. Normal retail shops are taken over by web shops and things like so. My point here is we should really take a step back and think completely differently. And going back to my own work, I try to do that every now and then. And a good example of that is that I was invited to the Dutch Design Week just half a year ago. That is a week-long celebration of Dutch design, and that has everything to do with furniture, art, what have you. But there was a session on food and how can we think and approach all these issues differently. And I learned a lot there. People with a complete different mindset outside of my normal world, and coming up with new ideas and new approaches, ranging from knitted meat, literally, to completely other ways of feeding ourselves and producing our own food, which may hold an answer to many of the questions that we have. Another one struck me yesterday when I saw in the news that a Canadian boy found a Maya city. Some of you may have heard it on the news. Just by looking at the setup, comparing it to some open data on the net by the stars, and he found a Maya city that many scholars and many academics had never found. So that is my recommendation or my point here to you. Open up, put everything you have on the web, like Mars did a few years ago when they had the challenge of a depleting supply of cacao. They said, we see a threat to our whole industry. We can't find a solution. Please, public, you chocolate lovers, help us. And that is, I think, what I would like to put forward here as a point for discussion. How can we tilt the way that we are doing research? How can we, and you made that point eloquently, how can we involve the private sector? Just as a comparison, and I was asked to write on the blog series about that. You have a food and climate research network. In the Netherlands, we came up with a food and business knowledge network, since we think there's a whole truckload full of knowledge in the private sector that is very difficult to tap into. But if you approach the private sector by a common challenge, by shared problems, and of course, in the end, hopefully, shared solutions, and that's my experience, they are very much willing to cooperate and think of, and I'm a policy maker, think of policies that can help us change for the better. Maybe as a last one, I hear the Cargill ringing again. And that is looking ahead again. And actually I forgot my points, which is good for you, because then I just stop now. I have many more points, but I'll save those for discussion. So thank you.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
go straight on to Duncan.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me here. And I mean, one of the reasons WWF is working on food systems is because of TARA and FCRN and the How Low Can You Go report. Yeah, they're responsible for what I'm doing, for good or bad, I hate to say. But yeah, so looking at the food system, the challenges and going forward, I've got sort of 4 things I would like to say. And the first is we need to look at food in a less divisive manner. We're still in a place where people keep polarising debates. So you still hear people going, oh, GM good, GM bad. Organic's the answer, organic's not the answer. Food security is global. No, food security is local. And I think we need to get into those middle grounds quite urgently because we're not getting there. We're still not getting there. And I think that's part of the problem. It's very easy when you polarise things to not come up with solutions. I think things are starting to move, but I don't think they're moving well enough. And there's a couple of examples as well that I think show why this is causing a problem. UK food policy at the moment, you have a 25-year plan for food and farming. Part of that policy is going to be to grow the export sector of UK food, particularly the livestock sector. We know the livestock sector is an enormous emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. At the same time, we have the 5th carbon budget, whose goal is to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions coming from the UK sector. They're going against each other. If we increase the livestock sector, we're not going to reduce carbon emissions, so we're not going to meet our climate change targets. So government policies are going in opposite directions. And another one, which I think is more pertinent and more recent, is when we started our work on sustainable diets, we talked about reformulation of food. And WWF got attacked by people like the NFU for being anti-meat, because we said we should have more meat, less meat in our food, less meat in our meals, and we should put more vegetables in it. A couple of weeks ago, the NFU produced a report which said we need to eat more UK-grown fruit and veg. Part of the solution to that is reformulating our meals and putting more fruit and veg in them. So that's one. The second one, the seas. We've not talked about seas. We've not talked about the oceans. I think the seas are a cause for huge concern. I also think they're an enormous part of the solution. Cause for concern is not just overfishing, which terrifies me. We need to recognise, though, that sea levels are going to rise. If sea levels rise, we're going to lose land. We're going to lose water sources. We're going to see inundation. That's going to drive people off their land. We're going to lose, those communities are going to have to move somewhere. Where's that land going to come from? Where's their food going to come from if they're no longer getting seafood? That is a huge concern. We're also going to lose some sources of water. That's not part of the debate, and it really should be, because we should be worried about these communities and how it's going to impact on global food security. And we also need to look at, if we overfish, where are we going to get our protein from? We need protein. People are always talking about protein. They've added protein to Weetabix. It's crazy. And if we're going to overfish, where are we going to get the protein from? Probably from the land. What's the land footprint for that? That is really concerning, because if we're going to keep growing more protein on land, we're going to need more land. If we're going to need more land, where's that going to come from? Probably from nature, so we're going to lose biodiversity, because every time people versus nature clash, nature loses. But also, we have great solutions. We can sustainably manage the seas. We can manage the fish. But we also have this wonderful thing called mariculture, which is the role of mariculture in mitigating future food losses. And that should be farming the seas, not just for fish, but also for things like seaweed. And we're seeing around Scotland, the growth of the seaweed industry is great, and it's a fantastic form of food. So that's part of the solution, I think, is mariculture, and that'll develop income streams as well. The third thing I think that we need to look at is plants. Sorry. I think plants really are a massive part of the solution. And I think whenever I'm asked what should we do, because it's so complicated, I do say it's eat more plants. Yesterday, a fantastic report was produced called The State of the World Plants by IQ. I really recommend you read it. It's a really interesting report. It's very terrifying, but they talk about particularly the role of wild relatives in ensuring food security. And I think that's a really exciting, underexploited opportunity for businesses, for people, for us to eat. And I think we need to look at plants because they are really tasty and get away from this ridiculous idea that plants are boring. We can't eat plants. They're for vegans, and vegans, are really weak as kittens and that sort of thing. We need to eat plants. We need to celebrate plants. We need to look at them, and we need to get them back into our food system and grow more of them and eat more of them. So I would say that. And then the other thing I really think we need to look at is look at some of the other myths that are around. And this is one I don't accept that it's difficult to change consumption patterns. I really don't. I think if we look at how our diets and how agriculture has changed, it has changed massively over the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And what we're eating today is different from what we ate 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. My grandmother wouldn't recognise what we're eating today, certainly not our breakfast cereals. So I think we do change our eating habits. They do change rapidly. If we didn't, food companies wouldn't spend so much money on marketing and advertising, and there wouldn't be so many bloggers on the latest diet fads, whether it's paleo or vegan before 6. So I think we do change our eating habits. I think they can change. Example of this is cake. Cake used to be a celebration. We used to eat it maybe at weekends, birthdays, at Christmas. Now people want cake every single day. The rise of the cupcake is terrifying. I like cake, but a bit bored of that. And I think companies will be really important in this. So I'm saying, yes, we can change our eating habits and we can find a solution.
Thanks a lot, Duncan. That's a really fascinating, positive message. Sonia.
Well, I'll start off terrified knowing that Charles has his finger on the clock. And I come from the development research community, and I'd like to actually take Mike's comments on urbanization as a taking off point for thinking about what's happening in Africa and Asia, where 80% of the world's people live. Because as people are moving into cities, it doesn't just mean that there are more people in the cities, it's also a huge driver of change of how people are living, working, and running farms in the rural areas. The entire food systems are changing. And Tom Reardon, for instance, estimates that the rate of pay, the rate of change in food systems in Africa and Asia is about 4 to 5 times the rate of change in GDP growth. So we're going way ahead in this accelerated change. What does it consist of? Well, in some places it's the rise of supermarkets, particularly in Asia and including in China. That's a little bit slower in Africa. But it's also changes towards much more processing in the system. Food chains which are longer geographically because farmers are taking their food into cities, but also much shorter in terms of the number of people involved. All of those traders who used to be a huge part of the rural spectrum and the rural economy are not there, as farmers are now selling directly to mills and to retailers. So it's looking very, very different. What we're seeing now in Asia, for example, is that the urban food market is about 75% of the total food market. Farmers are seeing that as their market. It's much higher than the urban population share. So there's this strong shift towards everything going into urban areas. Interestingly, this also affects the way that rural consumption is happening too. The rural areas of Africa and Asia remain the places where malnutrition is concentrated, those people who still don't have enough calories to get by. Now, what people are seeing, what the kind of changes that we're seeing there, is that people are much more dependent, even there, on processed foods as part of their diets. We will see even in rural Africa, about 25% of food that people are getting is either partially processed or very heavily processed foods. So you're seeing almost a transmission of food coming back from urban areas into rural areas and people depending on that. At the same time, there's a huge job component to that. So with that urbanization, the transformation, we're seeing change from 80% of a country's population being employed in growing food to only about 20%. So what are all of these people doing? Now, here I want to draw attention to not only the rapid change, but a kind of a bifurcation and in how people are making money and the widening inequality that's associated with that. So some are able to take advantage of this, move to cities, get those jobs, get the remittances, get new jobs in food processing, for instance, as well, while we're having other groups of people who either geographically, they're very far from cities, or within their own communities, are getting closed out of these agrarian and new ways of making money out of food markets. So what does this mean for you, Tara? Let's go back to you to answer your question. So your job and your special role in life is to say things that make absolutely everybody uncomfortable. And I think by doing that, actually to achieve what you've said here, to overcome some of those divisions that we, and the classic polarization that we see in discussion of food systems. So let me just go through a few reflections from this development perspective of what you might be doing. I think one of the first things is that understanding that it's often the economic value of food production and of food systems that really drives outcomes for people in terms of their nutritional well-being. For farmers in Africa, it's not the food that they grow, it's the food that they buy with the income they get from that. They actually buy about half of the food that they eat. So a shift to thinking about the role of jobs in food systems, I think, would be incredibly useful, and particularly given the global application of that. We're seeing that many jobs are unstable, these are zero-hour contracts, these are the norms, and also who's employed in food systems. It's often women, it's often now immigrants as well. Which leads me to the next point. I mean, you said earlier on that when you started your work, you did food miles because transport was the artery of globalization. I'd like to challenge that. Sorry, I'm going off already. I'll finish just on this point. That actually very little food crosses borders. We know that only about 18% of food does globally. From most developing countries, only 5 or 10% of food gets exported. 90% is going into these domestic markets. So what is crossing borders and what is happening with globalization is the export of those business models, the ideologies, the technologies, the information. And again, just given your very, very particular set of skills and ability to irritate and your ability to think holistically and join up between ideology and stuff, I think, again, to be able to be sending out some of those messages to the world, thinking about the export of values. Thank you. Stop there.
Now, I can see Ellen here, and she has appeared miraculously on the screen. Ellen, can you hear me? Ellen, can you...
Okay, can you hear me? Because I don't hear you anymore.
We hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, good. Okay, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to this event. And a special thanks for letting me participate online like this. Because what I also think is very important is that we try to find ways of doing research and food system research in a more sustainable way also. And that we try to find ways to collaborate and discuss that includes less traveling. So I'm happy to be able to participate. And I know that this is an area that the FCRN and Tara are also very interested in and looking at ways to engage with people without having to fly around the globe. So, but I mean, on to today's topics. I think when I thought about, when I reflected about what Tara and Mike and the other panelists said here, I think one important thing for me also is the need for the research community to communicate better. And of course, the food system and all its challenges, it's a very complex area, and it is difficult to communicate in an understandable and relevant way, but I think it's very, very crucial that we do so and that we try really hard. And I mean, because if we fail to do this, there's a long line of these self-appointed experts that are ready to deliver these very simple and attractive messages that lead to these very polarized views on things that Duncan mentioned. So I think it's very important, and that also we improve the discussion around, like Tara highlighted, the assumption and values that are, you know, behind all research and studies, and how these assumptions affect the results and the conclusions that we draw from different studies. And here I think the FCRN has really done some great work in this area and it has an important role to play in the future as well. And then the other thing that I wanted to throw into the debate here is, I think also we need to talk more about responsibilities of different actors in the food system and in the food chain. So we need to start thinking about what different actors can do and what they should do. So first we need to figure out what capacity different actors have in their roles. So what can we expect from consumers? What can we expect from producers? What can industries do? What's the role for the state and public agencies, NGOs, and so on? And as a next step, we need to then discuss, I mean, what responsibilities do different actors have? Because of course, these actors have varying degrees of power, and with that comes responsibility. So I think we should discuss this and also bring in ethicists and like moral philosophers into this discussion. And these types of discussions and the conclusions we can draw from them could be used by civil society to put some pressures on these different actors then to get things to really happen. And then my last point, I think, we all know that we're in quite deep trouble, both when it comes to environmental impacts, climate change, biodiversity loss, water, and all other things. And also when it comes to nutrition, of course, huge challenges when it comes to undernutrition in poor countries and overconsumption and so on. So what we need is really major changes, and not only changes, I think, to the food system. I think, of course, we need changes to the whole society. So I just as Tara said, we need to broaden this area from the food system. But we're also, of course, I mean, locked into the current system, and we need to operate within the current system and make that better. But we shouldn't get stuck in dealing with the current system. We need to look beyond, I think, and look for how things could be and what future sustainable food systems could look like, and how sustainable production systems could look like, so that we know that when we're making smaller changes and suggestions for policy and so on, that we're moving in the right direction. So that was really my reflection on the day, and thanks again for inviting me, and congratulations to the FCRN, and keep up the fantastic work.
Thanks. And that's absolutely miraculous to get the IT working at Oxford, because we normally work on carrier pigeons and things like that. So what we are going to do now is just to ask for questions from the floor about any of the issues that our five fabulous panelists have raised, and also anything that's come up from Tara and Mike's talk earlier on. Who would like to go first? So, one lady there.
Thanks. I'm Sarah from Feedback Again.
I've got questions for, is it Marcel from
Yes.
the Netherlands? It's just about two bits of information I read in the Politico daily email on agriculture. One was saying that in the Netherlands you're going to have a food ministry. Is that right? And is that a good model? Is that a way to solve some of our problems by putting them all together politically? And is that something we should advocate? The second thing was about pigs dying, because farmers can't afford the feed for them, because it's very expensive imported feed. And at Feedback, we've got a lobby or an aspiration to overturn the European ban on feeding catering waste to pigs. So just your comments on whether you think that's a good aspiration, whether we should be feeding pigs catering waste, would it be cheaper, would it be more efficient, would it help the farmers and also stop the wastage, or should we not be eating pigs at all?
Having been posted to Washington, and I lived there for 4 years, I was a great admirer of Politico, but this time they do have their sources wrong, unless they know more than I know, because there's talk about a food ministry, but that is coming from some sources that argue that should be a good idea. But there's no decision yet. We have elections next year, and maybe this is going to be part of We always have coalition agreements, so some of the political parties may put this at the table of those negotiations. And
But do you think it's a good idea?
I think it could be a good idea, and I refer back to a report, and perhaps Politico did the same, written by the Scientific Council for Government Policy. That's one of the advisory bodies of the government, and they came out with a report last year saying we should change our way of looking at this economic sector, from looking at the agrarian sector or agriculture, and change our lens in this case to food. And that means if you're really following this line of reasoning, that you should indeed come to something like that, like a food ministry, and combining health, agriculture, maybe some environmental or climate issue, energy, so that there are all kinds of elements from other ministries that you could combine, and I think it could work. So it's and then about pigs, that's the other question. Your exact question was, what do we feed pigs, or are pigs dying, or I didn't really get the
Whether you think, you know, the report was that pigs were dying because farmers couldn't afford to feed them in the Netherlands, and the question is whether you think overturning the ban on feeding them catering waste is a good aspiration.
It taps into, I think, the question that you earlier asked on food waste. If you can make waste a resource for something else, I think that's the right way to go. Whether there are all kinds of other things against that, I don't know. I'm not a specialist on that, but and I also don't know whether the pigs are dying because of the lack of feed they get. I actually doubt it, because we have strict animal welfare laws in the Netherlands. But it's again, it could be a good idea to kind of redirect some of the other streams, in this case waste, to make it a resource. I think again that could be a good idea.
Thank you. Mara, we're going to keep you fit. One at the front, and then one at the back again. At the back first. Lady in the black shirt.
Hello, I'm Hannah Lawson. I coordinate the Sustainable Food Cities Network, which is a UK network of 44 cities and towns, taking a joined-up approach to creating a more sustainable food system locally. We're currently entering our second 3-year phase of work, and we surveyed the 44 cities in our network about what should be our thematic campaign focus. We gave them 4 options, and the one that ranked at the dead bottom was looking at the intersection of food and climate change, specifically a campaign to tackle meat consumption. I'm wondering what advice, and I would really take an answer from anyone, including the audience, you might have for these local food partnerships. When we pushed back and asked a little bit more about why this idea of a campaign ranked so low, and really quite a bit lower than the other options that they were looking at, they said that they felt that they couldn't get the political buy-in. So I'm very keen to hear your suggestions on ways that we can encourage these local food partnerships, who absolutely are sympathetic to the issues that we're discussing today, to be really bold and reach out with new thinking and new ideas, to engage particularly public sector bodies, but equally other allies in their communities, to take meaningful action.
Thanks. Who would like to take that one? Then I might ask Mike if he has any comments, as he's worked a lot in cities in the States.
I'd also like to say something, yeah. Well, why don't you speak first, Mike?
You go first.
Okay. I'm just brainstorming and throwing an idea in there. So what also struck me when Tara was talking is that climate change is typically understood in the UK as a mitigation issue, that we need to reduce our environmental footprint. And perhaps you could stir some interest by bringing in the impacts and adaptation side to that. So, for example, telling the story about how climate change is impacting on some of the important foods that people have. And you could start with some of the ones like tea and coffee, where the results are very near term, they're being felt already, and you could already be able to give a narrative on how much prices are going to go up, and also some human interest stories on what's happening to some of the farmers involved.
Any other comments from the...
Yeah, maybe a short one. I just refer back to the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals last year. As you all know, in New York, 17 goals were adopted to attack all kinds of development but global challenges. There was one asterisk with those 17, and that was the one with climate. Climate said we need our own conference, and that was Paris. And that for me was an illustration of something else. That climate climate people are operating in their own bubble almost, and we need to get them out. And probably we're not going to do it by addressing them, but basically doing what you just referred to is stimulating other movements. And I referred in my remarks to trends that are taking place already, and Airbnb and Uber are examples of that. But I see emerging trends in this case as well, where young people are eating differently. Consumers are asking different questions. And if you can stimulate those trends and make those people in the bubble look obsolete, I think you're getting there.
Thank you. Duncan.
And I'd just like to sort of echo that, because I recognise people are scared of talking about meat, but we've been doing it for 7 years. We've been attacked for 7 years by some very, very powerful groups. But when you talk to people on a day-to-day basis, when you see what's happening, people aren't scared of it. Increasingly, particularly young people, but people of my generation, people of my parents' generation, recognise meat's an issue. They recognise meat is causing health problems. They recognise the environmental things. It's not as scary as it was, but it's how you message it. It's around moderate meat consumption, not no meat. So we don't advocate vegetarianism. It's about red and white meat, not just demonising one type of meat, and also celebrate the types of meat that if you think are actually quite good in the right amounts you eat them. And at the same time, it's coming up with the positive messages, and we've found pushing plant-based eating, promoting vegetables, eating a variety of foods has worked wonders. We've worked with chefs, we've worked with sort of communicators, and we're getting quite a bit of ground. And for WWF in our Earth Hour, it's our most significant global campaign, and for the last 3 years the most visited web pages and the most talked about part of our work has been our stuff on sustainable meals and eating less meat as part of that. So if policymakers and councils are scared of it, they're in the minority now.
Thank you. Corinna, did you want to comment on this at all?
I'll say something later.
Mike.
Well, I don't know if this is helpful or not, but a parallel theme for us. So in Michigan, my first 10 years in Michigan, the state had a deficit of about $1 billion every year because the auto industry collapsed. And when we were talking to the agricultural community, which is very conservative in general, and talking about organic farming and direct markets and farmers markets and things like that, what I tried to do was to listen to where they were at and come from that point and not expect them to come from the point that I wanted them to come from. So in my conversations with them, I never talked about environmental benefits or supply chain distances or anything like that. I talked about market opportunities and income for farmers. And that was okay with them. And so I don't know if it helps or not, but it may be that that's not where people are at right now, but there's probably correlated things in the community that people would be at that could then draw them along. And so one of the things to think about is don't try to take people where they're not, but maybe try to take people where they are and see how that can move them into where you think they ought to be.
Thanks very much. Mike, would you pass the microphone to the lady behind you?
Thank you. I'm Angela Wright from Compassion in World Farming, and I think like many of us in the room and indeed on the planet, we're worried about food waste. But we also consider that human edible grain that's fed to animals is a waste of food. And we see that that encourages intensive agriculture, intensive farming of animals, and has a terribly detrimental effect on animal welfare. So in that context, I'd be interested in the panel's thoughts on that issue.
Thank you. Who would like to take that?
Yeah.
Duncan?
Okay, so it's a tricky one, because I work for a global organisation. So personally, I think we need to look at the feed issue. The feed issue is quite terrifying. The amount of soy that's grown and the impact it has on the natural environment, particularly in South America, not just the Amazon, but places like the Cerrado, the Pantanal, etc. It's terrifying how much is going. The plans for expanding soy production in places like Mozambique, one of the last unsport savannas in the world, is also terrifying. And it is, as Angela says, mainly so we can have cheap meat and dairy. So I think it's a really, really important discussion. I'm always amazed that it's still not as high up the priority list as it should be. It's also one of the most subsidised industries, so it's artificially low, and we need to remember that taxpayers' money is subsidising it. It's also reliant on oil and gas. Oil and gas is also massively subsidised, so taxpayers' money pays for that. So it's a whole mess of issues. So I think we need to look at feed, we need to look at alternate feeds and do a lot of research into it, whether it's insects, etc., lupins, whatever. We need to look at them, they're important. I agree that we need to look at what we do with food waste. It's a scandal with food waste goes to landfill, and if it really is a genuine scandal, and that's something I think my sort of grandkids are going to just look at me and go, what? You threw away food? Really? So I think we need to look at alternate feeds. I think it should have a lot more importance than it does. But it's not just for land-based animals. We have to look at alternate feeds for fish as well, because we shouldn't be feeding soy to fish, to salmon, whatever. We need to look at everything, and there's some amazing resources out there that we should be taking advantage of that will hopefully alleviate the pressure on the natural environment.
Thank you. We're beginning to get a lot of questions, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 3 questions and then go to the panel to pick on them. Mara, could you go to the back? Alfie, and then Mark, and I think there's another question back there, and then we'll slowly track around the room. And if everyone could be as brief as possible so we can get to the maximum number of questions.
So my name's Alfie Gaithorn-Hardy. I'm from the Oxford India Centre for Sustainable Development. And I want to ask probably quite a naive question, but quite a few people talked about the word power. And Corinna, you talked about that you believe in framework of regulation, but I'm working in India, specifically in the States, and there some of the large private organizations that work in food, for example, Unilever, have such considerable power that they're quite hard to regulate at times. And I'm wondering what kind of solutions you see to this problem of imbalance of power within the food system.
Thank you. Could you pass it to Mark beside you?
Mark Driscoll, Head of Sustainable Food Programme at Forum for the Future. My question actually is to Tara as much as the panel in terms of future role of the Food and Climate Research Network. I think there's a big action research gap. There is a lot of existing research out there from academia, but sometimes it's really difficult to interpret in a way that's meaningful for businesses, for consumer groups, for other NGOs. And there's a bit of a danger of analysis, paralysis by analysis. One of my questions is, how can the Food and Climate Research Network facilitate better collaborations between the research community and the private sector? And a second point is how can we move away from a very siloed research community? So how can we use the research from our academic institutions, from things like the Agri-Tech strategy, in a more holistic way that really pulls together the nutrition, sustainability, and health debates? Because in my view, that's still quite siloed. So it's a question really to Tara.
And there's another question just in that group there. Over to your left there.
Dave Little from University of Stirling. I like the fact that the network is looking at China and is looking at Latin America. And I think if we look at the demographics around the world, the global north, the global south, I think one of the big questions for everyone in this room and this organization is how we project into these very fast growing and rapidly changing parts of the world. Because we can talk a lot sitting in a bit of green leafy UK, but actually, you know, there's a lot happening in the rest of the world that's going to have effect on food systems for everyone.
Thanks very much. Camilla, would you like to answer Alfie's question? And Tara, do you want to come up here? Camilla, I do beg your pardon.
The range of questions or
the power of the...
Right, sure, yeah. It's difficult to deal with the power of the private sector. And if you look at the rate of mergers and acquisitions, it only gets more powerful. And I, again, favour thinking about it in terms of, first of all, we need to understand why and in what ways they want to exert their power. So that comes down to the kind of the points that have been made about understanding different people's perspectives and what incentives they have to behave in the way that they do. It sounds rather straightforward against this huge power, but I actually think that's rather important to seek to understand. And I think the second part of it is innovation. I won't dwell on that. A third part of it is to do with competition law. So the way that competition law is often interpreted in many countries is that if food is cheap, that's a sign of good competition. And that's how competition law is measured. If we had a different interpretation of competition law, we would find ourselves less willing to allow mergers and acquisitions in the way that we have. And so I think you need to actually start to stand back and actually look at the way that competition works in our food system. I think we have a system of lazy capitalism, where we are allowing big companies to be lazy and make money about exploiting, manipulating what they consider innate preferences, but which are not. And rather we need to step back and say, what kind of competition do we want in our food system to encourage innovation and encourage healthy innovation? And I think we'd be looking and talking about envisioning a different food system, quite a different food system.
Thanks, Corinna. Tara, 2 questions, I think, for you.
So the first one was from Mark, and it was about research, business, interactions, collaborations, and so forth. And I think that's a difficult one, and we've talked about this before anyway. I think one of the problems is that business want answers to the questions that they define, and the questions that they define are those that are to do with profit and short-term thinking, whereas sometimes they need to be asking questions that they haven't yet thought about, but that don't immediately make them money, and therefore they don't formulate them. And at the same time, the research community is discussing and thinking about things that business might consider to be very arcane or abstract. So there's a kind of language and timescale barrier, firstly. And I think the second thing is that within the research community, this relationship between, the metrics of success are not skewed in favour of actually having any effect whatsoever on the real world. And that's a real problem, that it's all about your impact factor for a journal rather than how much you actually change things, and whether that's influencing civil society activities or changing the way businesses do business is a question. Plus there's also legitimate, I think, concerns by some academics about working for business and somehow having their research findings skewed or compromised. So I think there's that to think about as well. But ultimately, there needs to be a way in which businesses can engage with researchers so that they can start to have their perspectives on the questions they ought to be asking and the challenges they ought to be addressing, having all those things expanded. And researchers need to find a way of being incentivized to communicate what they think about, plus also think about research questions that are pertinent to the real world. So a mechanism for that needs to be more openly established, and maybe that's something that the Food Climate Research Network can think about doing in collaboration with others who are also struggling in this area.
If I could just interject a rather parochial thing here. So the academic world responds to incentives, and one of the incentives is the impact agenda. The impact agenda at the moment isn't really well designed to produce what Tara has just called about. There are many people from civil society here. You should be lobbying the Stern Review about how we're going to be incentivized in the academic world in the next 10 years to say exactly what type of information that would be useful. And so there is a window of opportunity now to change the incentives for the research community. Tara, did you want to address Dave Little's?
Yes. So there's the kind of the what about China, the what about India, the what about Brazil, and everywhere else question, and how you move away from leafy Oxford to try and engage in all these issues. And I think Mike and Sonia have talked about this as well. I think it's this question, and again Sonia's touched upon it, this idea that we need not just technological leapfrogging, but also values-based leapfrogging. We need to start thinking about societal leapfrogging, starting to think about how to avoid the problems that we're trying to wrestle with right now. And I think actually one of the things that I have just recently heard is that in a few days' time, the Chinese government is going to be coming out with a new set of food-based dietary guidelines, which are, among other things, going to recommend substantially reducing meat consumption. So, you know, that perhaps is an example of trying to get ahead of the game before all the problems become entrenched. But obviously there are technological technologies and farming techniques and processing techniques, all of which it's not about following the West, but it's about trying to develop new locally appropriate solutions. And I don't have the answer to that, but I think we need to have more discussions about how things look different depending on where you are and who you are in different parts of the world.
Thank you. So if we can have some questions from the middle of the room. David was wanting to, and then Vicky beside, and then the gentleman there.
David Dawes, University College London. The question is largely for Tara, but I think it also relates to the comments from the panel. And it's about the penultimate question in your circle of difficult questions, i.e. what is a fair price for food? Back in the 1970s, when I was at the OECD, we did some work on applying the polluter pays principle to agriculture. We tried again at FAO in the 1980s, right? But none of the ministers wanted to even think about it, right? Because it isn't really an economic question, it's a socio-political one, and they didn't want to touch it. Now, given your experience over the past 11 years, do you feel there's a new way of going forward on this?
Thank you. If you could pass the microphone to your left.
I'm Vicky Hurd. I'm campaigns director at War on Want now, but I have been working on food for about 25 years, and I've done what Tara said actually at the beginning. I've put it in its box, and I now work on trade and tax havens and boring things like that. But I do know that politics is at the heart of a lot of what actually is decided in terms of things, as Karina was talking about. And I'd like to ask all the members of the panel, if I can get from them, which change they would like to see in governance, be it national or international, they think will make the biggest difference in the next 10 years, when we meet again, because Tara's done 22 years or whatever, if she's still here after 22 years, what will be have seen a change in governance, specifically the politics and governance of food?
Excellent. And then the gentleman here with the blue top.
Hi, I'm Thomas. I just finished a degree in climate change management at Birkbeck, where I had the pleasure to interview Tara and Vicky as well. My question is more about the systemic changes that are needing to be made, that Marcel touched upon, and Corina as well, with lazy capitalism. It's a big question. I'm going to try to narrow it down as best as I can. I just spent 4 months in Brazil immediately after I finished at Birkbeck, which is in some regards the ground zero for climate change with what's happening with the deforestation there. And coming back, I came across something called a green bonds investment based in the city that have very close ties with the United Nations framework on climate change. And they are now trying to move big amounts of capital from the traditional financial markets into green bonds, but on a very large scale, because they don't believe that politicians are able to implement the necessary changes fast enough. And I just wondered if you had any kind of opinions on
Thanks
this
very
approach.
much. Tara, do you want to answer David's question first?
So, the what is the fair price for food and the polluter pays question. I mean, I think the question has so many different dimensions that I think it's impossible to answer that particular aspect of the question in isolation. So, firstly, yes, I think there needs to be a mechanism through which the environmental costs of food production are encapsulated, incorporated in the end price of the product. But I mean, I think one of the questions is which environmental aspects are we talking about, and how do we measure them? Because usually the simpler the metric, the cruder it is, or the easier it is to measure, the kind of less meaningful it is. For example, tons of nitrogen fertilizer going into the soil, well, that's a proxy for nitrous oxide emissions, but it depends on the pre-existing conditions of the soil and all the rest of it, everything that you're very familiar with. And then what happens to the end price of the food, and what is that balance between production costs and consumption costs? So going back to what Sonia was saying, in some parts of the world, people are net producers of food, but increasingly in many parts of the world, they're net consumers of food. So high food prices might be good for producers, and if they're poor producers, that's good. But if they're also buying large chunks of their food, then that's a problem. Whenever I talk to Charles about the fair price for food, so if you go and sit in NGO circles, they'll say, food is too cheap, we need to make it more expensive, and the more expensive you make food, the less they'll be able to spend on other things that use energy, and so on and so forth. If you go and talk to the international development community, they'll say cheap food is good when people are spending 70% of their household income on food, which means they can't afford to pay for healthcare, education, and so forth. I go and talk to Charles, and Charles says, but the more expensive food is, the more governments will be worried about a revolution or a riot, the more there'll be erosion of regulations and land controls, and it could be a biodiversity Armageddon. So all depends on what happens about your assumptions about the governance framework, and then there's the political legitimacy. I just don't know the answer to this.
Tara, I'm going to stop you there, I think. Okay. It's always slightly scary when I talk to Charles. So I'm going to ask so Vicky's great question about, on the political economy, what would you like to see most? I'm going to ask each of the panel in turn, and at the same time, if you want to say anything about Thomas's question on green bonds. Sonia, what would you go for first?
Okay, well, I strongly support the price of food going up for all the reasons that have been well explained. And what I'd like to see coupled with that governance-wise is to deal with the difficulties for poor consumers through income support rather than through food price support. So that's in short. I would like to answer another question of going to the back. I think this is important. We're talking about how to get the message out more to China and India. I really don't think that it's appropriate for a strongly UK-based organisation to be thinking in those terms. I was rather glib in describing what FCRN's role was, but I see a set of very clear questions being asked, a very clear use of scenarios for the future. And Tara, let me also touch on your literary skills, moving out of the scientific world. Brilliant. And I think the correct audience, both for the policy research outputs and the associated advocacy, is UK and global institutions and companies, not domestic ones in other countries. Sorry, over to you.
Okay. Well, what I would like, looking at the whole policy environment, three things very quickly. One, I would like to see a senior civil servant with power behind him, with responsibility for food policy in the Cabinet Office in the United Kingdom, who is completely independent, who has oversight of what I calculated a couple of weeks ago, the 12 different government departments with responsibility for food elements. And any decision related to food must be based on 5 principles that are agreed together that will help deliver sustainable, healthy food. I would like to see at Europe the scrapping of the common agricultural policy and the common fisheries policy, and to be recreated by a common food policy. And for anyone to get any funds from it, at the absolute heart of this, you must prove you're delivering true change and enhancement to small communities, and you are working to protect nature. Only then can you qualify for any of the subsidies. And at the global level, I think we should look at the Sustainable Development Goals. I was in a meeting in Rome last week with all the UN bodies, and it was frankly terrifying because nearly every single one of them was talking about them as though they're Millennium Development Goals. It was still about agriculture, we must produce more. No mention of marine by anyone. When I said, what about the environment? It was almost like, yeah, go back in your box. So I would like to see the Sustainable Development Goals actually delivering sustainable development on a global level, which treats nature and society at equal levels, and we deliver what they're set out to deliver.
Creative use of top priority there, Duncan, but those are all fascinating. Marcel.
You know what, for your second level, that means for the UK if you want to change EU policies, huh? That's not going further into that. I just, 2 weeks ago, I attended a meeting in the Netherlands on talking about food changes, food systems and things like that. And there were two main speakers. The one was our Prime Minister and the other one was the CEO of Unilever, Paul Polman. I think many of you know him. And for, let's say, an distant observer asking the question, who do you think here is the most powerful? Listening to them, I think many people would have said that's Paul Polman. And in fact, he is. If Unilever would have been a country, it would rank amongst the biggest 30 in the world. So if going back to the power question, governments alone are not going to do it. And you refer to some of the other government layers internationally, globally, at the moment, and I'm afraid not strong enough to change that. So getting back to my earlier remarks, if you can't change it through the third dimension that you mentioned, regulation, you perhaps should do it by talking to them, engaging them, and maybe it's easy talking for me because Unilever is one of the companies that is ahead of the curve, or at least talking the talk and walking the talk to a large extent. But it's proving the point that you better go with them and try to change behavior than going against them. And to illustrate that point, I go to another international coalition, the Global Alliance for Climate Smart Agriculture. You can have many thoughts about that, and I know many of you have, about its effectiveness and the need for it, but interestingly enough, many NGOs say, we don't want to be involved because McDonald's is in there. And that's an interesting one, because McDonald's is controlling 2% of global meat production. So if you want to make significant changes there, you better start influencing McDonald's. So that's just maybe a little point to prove my bigger point is engage, because from the outside trying to regulate, they just jump to another country and open up a new letterbox there. So that's maybe a bit cynical, but I think also realistic.
Thanks, Marcel. Corinna.
Well, I think it comes back to the fact that food is a lived experience, and we have to remember that. I have to confess that in some of these discussions, I get a little lost. We're talking about these big issues, the price of food, for example. For my question is, what is the right price of food for people in a community? And we start there to try and answer that question, as opposed to abstracting and asking these big questions about meat and prices. I don't want to show disrespect to these extremely important questions, but they're too abstract. We just have to remember that food is a lived experience, and we have to start there. And it comes back to the people-centered nature of it. And the other point we need to remember is this point about connections. So we've heard a lot about meat this afternoon. I mean, one of the reasons that we have feed that feeds meat is because we have alcohol. A huge byproduct of alcohol production is feed for animals. So we talk about reducing food waste. Well, actually, the big industry is doing quite a good job of reducing food waste by reducing alcohol waste to animals. It's also producing trans fats and soybean oil, and soybean is an outcome of that and is fed for animals. So I think there's lots of examples of how we need to make these connections by going to people and saying, well, why are they eating this much meat? And then going back and asking these big questions about meat. So what does that mean for politics? Well, I have lots of points about national food policies and food committees and global governance that I can talk about. But at the end of the day, what I would like to see, if what is my vision about what change I would like to see every single politician in the world go through our course in food policy at City University London. Because I just really believe that, and I would not have said this 5 years ago.
That's because you worked at a different university.
I didn't. No. This is one of the reasons why I took my first job in a university, my first full-time job in a university. It's because I truly believe that we need to have, we need to open minds, and so people can better understand the connected nature of things.
Well, passing over that very shameless plug there. We've also been getting lots of comments from a big online audience by the web and carrier pigeons and things like that, which I won't go through, and we'll feed them into Tara, but really interesting things about what the FCRN can do on digitisation, helping build resilience, reducing waste throughout the value chain, and lots of comments about information transfer and things, so hopefully you'll find that very useful. So we are going to, sorry to say, finish the panel discussion now. Please join me in having a round of applause for all five of our speakers. Now we have one thing before the wine reception, unless Corinna's banned it because of the byproducts for food, and that is Jessica Finch is going to be providing us with a introduction to food bites. So if you guys would like to return to your seats.
Right, good afternoon, and I'll try and keep this short so that I know the wine is probably on people's minds now. But my name is Jessica Finch, and I am sort of starting out as a PhD student at the University of Warwick. But for the last few months, I've been doing an internship with the FCRN with Tara, and the main project that I was working on here was this quite exciting project that we're launching today, which is FCRN Food Bites. Which is a website, an online learning resource that is meant to provide a starting point and a platform, a research-based platform for anyone who is working within food sustainability, whether that's through research, policy, civil society, or industry. And perhaps also this may be a useful resource, a starting point that is available for students, that is somewhat less terrifying than perhaps just the vast wealth of information and complexity that we've seen today, that we've heard a lot today about the huge complexity that is out there. And it can be quite daunting, as someone who's only recently come into this myself, that it can be a daunting field to enter because there are so many aspects. And we've tried to provide this resource, produce this resource which brings everything together that we've been discussing today, and can provide, as I said, a starting point. This started out, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we developed this resource, and then I'll show you a little bit about how it works. So, as many of you know, Tara has a huge wealth, a vast array of presentations and slides that she has accumulated over, I think, not just the last 11 years, but probably before that. And shortly before I came onto the scene, Tara, along with an FCRN associate, Will Nicholson, started to bring these slides together and try and put them into a chapter-based format. So we started off with 10 chapters, and that's what we currently have, 10 chapters, although as I'll say in a minute, we're trying to go beyond that. So the process of getting from PowerPoints to the current resource that we have, that we're launching today, was quite a long process, involved a lot of editing stages. A lot of people have been involved, myself, Marie, Mara, various others, and also an extensive peer review process. And we do have a lot of people to thank for this. Oh, there it is. I don't know if that could be seen at the back. It might be clearer on the screens if you're at the back. A huge number of people have helped us with peer reviewing, an informal peer review process of the Food Bites resource. And this includes a number of people who have also provided large chunks of several of the chapters, who've added content. So we need to give particular thanks to Professor Tim Benton, who isn't here today, unfortunately, but who contributed enormously to chapters 1, 5, and 6. Dr. Pete Scarborough, who contributed largely to chapter 8. Ellen Roos, who we heard a short while ago, who contributed large sections of chapter 2. Pete Smith, who has contributed to chapter 3, and David Little, who has helped out enormously with chapter 5. But there have been a wider group of people who have had inputs in various different ways, and we do need to give a huge thanks to everyone who's been involved. Following that peer review process, we've then, John Jackson, our website manager, has done a huge amount of work in converting this into a website format, including producing a lot of really very lovely diagrams, and I will show you those in a minute. But if I just show you what the resource actually involves. So the web address has been on the screen all day. Hopefully many of you will have got it down. This is www.foodbites.org.uk. And the resource, as you can see, is arranged into 10 chapters, and each chapter, much like a chapter of book, is dealing with a certain area, a specific area of food sustainability. And we have tried, in this initial version of Food Bites, to address the really basic, fundamental areas of food sustainability, but this is fully in the knowledge that we have not yet we have not yet, and we may never have covered everything that there is to cover, and I will come back to that. So if I just show you one chapter, just to give you an idea of what there is to offer. Each chapter starts with a chapter overview and is divided into a number of sections. And our vision for this website is that you can use it however suits you. We have a numbering system that allows you to move through it linearly. So someone, for example, like myself, as a student just entering this field, can work through it and get a general overview from chapter 1 through to chapter 10. Or if you are already fairly well versed in these areas but know that there is something specific you want to find out more about, you can go to that specific area of the website. So from any chapter or any chapter page, you can access any other chapter or chapter page through this sidebar, for example. But within the chapters, you can navigate as so. So each chapter section, we've tried to make everything nice and bite-sized, so because, like I said, it can be an overwhelming area. So we've got drop-down sections. We have our references for every slide, and that includes extended further reading recommendations, as well as cross-references to other chapters. Obviously, these very interlinked issues. So wherever a chapter cross-references another chapter, you can jump between them as you wish. I would like to show one particular section just because John Jackson unfortunately isn't here today, but he's done a huge amount of work in producing this really very visual, in many ways very visual resource. And a very good example of this is this diagram here, which John produced, which you can probably see better on the TV screens or if you're watching on YouTube at home. So we want this to be an accessible resource in as many ways as possible. So while there is obviously text, there is a lot of information to cover. That we have got diagrams. Every chapter is full of informative diagrams that we want to make these issues more tractable to people. So everything is evidence-based. It's all based in research that has been carried out. We're not trying to push any particular agenda. It's very much in the same spirit as the FCRN in general. It's agenda-free. We're just trying to be a knowledge broker here. We're just trying to provide this knowledge in an accessible way. So I won't sort of go any more through the website, but please do take a look at it. We would we'd very much like to have feedback on this website from you. We want this to be an evolving resource. At the moment, this is the first version, in effect, of Food Bites, and we would like this to expand and develop over time as needs arrive. And we also want it to become a more collaboratively sort of owned resource, a collaborative resource. So we are aware that we have not covered everything. We couldn't possibly have done this. Already is the product of over 400 slides and accompanying notes. So there is still far more information out there. So we would welcome any feedback on areas, current areas that are given some coverage but that you would like to see expanded, or whole new chapters that you think would be important. So, for example, at present we do touch on aquaculture, but we know that that could very easily be its own whole chapter, aquaculture, maybe mariculture, as has been mentioned today. Globalization and trade, the food environment, food waste, that has come up a number of times today. We know that that is a big area, and it is touched on it, we haven't ignored it, but we would like to see more there. So we welcome feedback on any aspect of that, as well as any aspects of the usability or functionality of the website. If is there anything we've all been looking at it so much that we may not know if there is something that doesn't quite work for a user. So we would very much like to hear feedback, and the information for providing feedback is in this section that was at the top here. So it's emailing Marie mainly. As well as feedback, we're also very interested in any discussions about collaboration or further funding. Anyone who would like to be involved in Food Bites, please do get in touch. I think that's the main thing. That's Food Bites. So thank you.
Are there any questions for Jessica on Food Bites? Jessica, that was very clear indeed. Thanks so much. So we're going to move next door to for a glass of wine. But just before we go, so it's been a really fascinating afternoon. Thanks, Mike Ham, our 4 wonderful panelists for such an interesting discussion, and of course Tara. And I think my only reservation about this afternoon is my request for embarrassing anecdotes about Tara has been sadly not achieved. So it falls to me to come up with one. And this was, I think, the second time that I met Tara. And Tara was giving a presentation, I think, on how low can you go to a group with the Foresight Project. And I was sitting beside the chief scientific advisor for the government. And Tara sat down, and he turned to me and said, wow, that was impressive and scary. So thanks, Tara, so much. Congratulations on 11 years of FCRN, and best wishes for developing it over the next 11 plus years. Round of applause for Tara.